Hello, everyone. Welcome to This is Effing Hard, our brand new podcast, which is aimed at anyone in the software, tech, SaaS community, but I guess really focused towards an audience of founders, leaders, people who are going through the trials and tribulations of working in a business and trying everything they possibly can to scale that business. The idea is that we don't just talk about the glorification of the wonderful success and sunshine and rainbows that come with it, but actually we hopefully get into the nitty gritty of actually, do you know what? This is bloody hard sometimes. And there's some stuff that hopefully the people that we interview will be able to share that others can learn from. Today, I'm joined by Charlie Kennedy, who is a proven revenue leader, background of having worked in some incredibly successful businesses. And we're going to dig into that experience and understand where he's been, what he's done, and what he's learned. Charlie, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Lloyd. Thank you for having me. I've been really looking forward to this one. I think the whole kind of context around this podcast is really different and new. And I love the fact that you're looking at the kind of not necessarily just the positives, but also the harder part of it, which I think I've got a big thing about survival bias. We hear too much about the successes. Let's talk about some of the harder stuff, which is the reality of most people's day to day, to be honest.
It really is. It really is. Let's jump straight into it. Can you tell us a bit more about, just give us an overview of kind of your background, where you started, where you had the big chunks of success, and also just what you're doing right now?
Exactly. Yeah. I've had two careers. I call it pre-SaaS and post-SaaS. My first career was advertising media based in London, and I worked for some big agencies there, Carrot, Aegis Dentsu, then News International, Hearst. That was my first chunk of my career, probably the first sort of 13, 14 years. When I moved down to Brighton, I'm in Hove now, I was told through my network there's this cool company called Brandwatch. You could go and check them out. And that turned out to be a great software success of a British company, really. So I was there for 8.5, 9 years and left last summer. So that's my kind of main pivot into SaaS. And right now I'm working for a company called Dig. It's a kind of Series A, based out of Israel, but it's in the social intelligence scene. Super fun. I am technically a CRO, but I also do the SDR, the AE, the VP, and the CRO job, depending on which hour of the day it is. So it's great to go back to the kind of fundamental basics. I joined Brandwatch when it was about sort of 20 million and scaled it to 300. And I left a corporate culture. Now I'm back to the beginning. And I can tell you it's refreshing, it's fun, it's slightly chaotic, but it kind of brings you back to actually what you enjoy about software, which is the challenge of solving problems. And again, the content of this podcast, which is like there's lots of positives and good times, but there's also a lot of challenges as well.
I think it's so interesting, that point as well, because I interviewed somebody a couple of weeks ago who talked around the hardship of building a business and then in the last couple of years having to break that business back down again because they got really hit hard 2 years ago, as so many technology companies did. But what that led him to do is in the last 2 years is really focus on leading from the front from a sales perspective. And it taught him that is actually a part of the job that he loves. And that as building a business, he'd become further and further away from the coalface of speaking to customers, closing deals, and that buzz. And he said, actually, as much as I am a revenue leader, and I do enjoy that, and it's been bloody hard over the last couple of years, and I've had to break things back down again. What I've got back to is that feeling, that enjoyment, that thrill that I had earlier on in my career of identifying prospects, being in the hot seat, talking to customers, getting to that point of asking for the order and closing business. And I think a lot of people and a lot of revenue leaders I've spoken to in the last couple of years who've had challenges or redundancies, companies that they joined which have not maybe worked out as they expected. I've had many conversations where people have said, do you know what? Maybe put me back into an IC role and get me. I wouldn't mind that because actually that's where I started.
And I'm feeling that way at the moment. As you progress in your career, and I was kind of the global SVP of enterprise, when you're over the 200 million mark, I just felt that it was a great job, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but your biggest customers become the executive and also the private equity owner. So you become inward facing, and that's just by nature of doing it. And when you've got 100 odd people below it, you do have to build structures and rely on people to do that. But you're so right in terms of getting back to basics, is essentially the customers are the people who are fueling and keeping the lights on. So we should be spending as much time in front of them as possible. possible. And I think executive leaders of a certain scale start to lose that. And that's just the way some of the businesses work. But I agree with you. I'm now back selling again, and it's so much fun listening to customers, all their challenges, what they do and don't like about it. There's so much more human about it. And then winning and getting those orders out is still great. If you've been doing sales for a while, actually winning and then getting through the legal and procurement, that's the other hurdle that's there. But I totally agree. And it's interesting because I am seeing a rise. What I did see in my kind of latter years at Brandwatch was what I call the rise of the professional IC. And these are a lot of people who've risen to ranks, often tried management, didn't like it, but now actually want to return to that individual contributor. And many of them are 30s, 40s with families. They know how to prospect, speak to clients. They're highly accomplished and professional. And we're seeing a lot of people going back to that. And let's be honest, sometimes if you're a good IC, you can make more money than the CRO if you smash your quota. So, you get your time back. As long as you deliver, your job is safe and you can make an incredible amount of money. So I think we're going to see quite a bit of a return to that, particularly with the rise of AI, where we're going to see a span of control change based on leadership. And I think people are going to want top sellers who can really deliver revenue.
I absolutely agree. And I also think that I can see a time where, not too far from now actually, where we talk a lot at the moment, and obviously you and I have spoken about fractional leadership and hiring at the very top end of the business. But I can see a time where if you are an incredibly high performing IC, you may well go, actually, do you know what? I'm going to do two gigs at once, and I can do 2.5 days a week there and 2.5 days a week there, or 2 days and two, or however that shapes up. Because actually, if you're really bloody good at what you do, then you can probably make that work and have all the benefits of being in essentially a fractional sales contributor without, and that flexibility, because for obvious reasons, more today than ever before, people want flexibility.
Absolutely. And I think, I don't think people realize how quickly AI is changing the entirety of everything we do, and particularly how that will impact work. And I think you're right that there are many jobs that don't exist today that will be the future of jobs. But I think that kind of component fractional work is probably going to be an important part of it, where people can pick or choose what they want to do. And so it's going to become a bit more of a kind of marketplace. Won't necessarily be commoditized because the best people will rise to the top. But I think 2 or 3 years down the line, it'd be interesting if we look back at this conversation and see where things have moved. So I think, as I said, that span of control, I think for a lot of jobs, AI is going to be a bit of a white collar bloodbath, I think, in many ways. Any kind of managed service, which can be done more efficiently, going to be quite a bit of unemployment there. But of course, those jobs need to be repurposed. And with that, the whole job market. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. And as much of it almost sounds like a bit doom and gloom, but I think in many ways it's exciting because we're reimagining how society works and plays, if that makes sense.
Completely.
And I find it fascinating personally.
No, I agree. That you can imagine in our office and in offices across the globe, these conversations come up on an almost daily basis of something that we do now that we go, hang on, do we need to do it that way? Or how else could we do that? And and if not, who else is doing it in a different way? It's fascinating that how much reflection is probably happening in companies every single day globally to look at what they do and how they do it. I'm conscious of the fact that you have had this long and successful career in sales, Charlie. But was that always the plan when you were growing up a youngster? What was the view in terms of career? What did you think you would end up doing?
Yeah, well, it certainly wasn't selling technology or sales more broadly. As a kid, I mean, I wasn't quite an astronaut, but I mean, I was always quite taken, grew up on a good diet of kind of adventurers and explorers, whether it be the Shackletons, Scott of the Antarctic, or even the Great Push West in America. And I always thought myself, I've always been a passion for traveling and going places. So I always want to adventurer, maybe mixed with a bit of Indiana Jones is what I fancied myself as. But of course, these things rarely become true. But I think in many ways, I guess technology is that kind of pioneering element of it. And I do like that. I've been lucky enough to travel around the world quite a few times with my work. But now, I'm not sure, do people land in sales purposefully? I think increasingly it is. But I'd say is that if you leave with a very in-depth with an arts degrees from a Russell Group university, the question is, we still got this kind of mindset that becoming a lawyer or something like that is probably make your parents happy, right? But when you look at the kind of money you can earn in technology sales, it is insane. and it has only grown. So I think and it is a skill, particularly enterprise sales. This is always much about human psychology as it is about following process. It's definitely not everyone can do it. So I think we will see the rise of moving away from the kind of the perhaps the stigma that's been attached to sales for so many years, and actually we'll see this as actually a proper industry, which I think it already is, which is highly skilled and highly valued because the money's there. We just need the credibility to flow through, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think that probably the credibility comes from having more of a skills based learning model for sales and sales leadership, which hasn't really ever existed. There are sales methodologies that have existed, certainly from when I started. Spin was the first that I remember using, but through to Medic now would be the most talked about and the most popular. But actually, the ability to go and learn how to be an enterprise salesperson, how to be an enterprise sales leader, to take a course that is, and I know a couple of people who are working on this right now, and I think it's fascinating because I think that once you start to do that and somebody leaves school and says, I'm going to go and study on a course that is going to help me to become an enterprise salesperson, that's
Yeah.
when it changes. But I agree. I don't think anybody, I certainly didn't leave school and think, I can't wait to get into recruitment. That's going to be I didn't even know it existed. That's the truth.
Yeah, and it is. I think a lot of people fall into it in many ways, but it's been an enjoyable ride. I don't feel that I've missed out on anything. But maybe we need like a Hollywood movie to come along and make sales cool again. At the moment, it's always slightly pejorative in the way it looks at it, but you can kind
Yeah,
of
true. Very,
blockbuster.
very true. Who, either early or more recently, but who have been the biggest influences on your career?
This is a really good question because if I look at Brandwatch, I would say it was a hyper growth with a lot of M&A involved. We went from substantial growth. I had a number of leaders across that time who I think all taught me different things. They're generally the CROs we had and the CEOs. So I think to focus on one person, I think wouldn't be fair in the sense that at that particular point of view, which is why they were brought in, they
Yeah,
all really helped me in my journey. And some of them taught me to think big. Some of them taught me to think strategically, to be a leader. I'd worked in large corporate organizations like News Corp and Hearst, but I'd never been, when you've
yeah,
got lots of people you're in charge of, it is a big step up. It's a big responsibility, but also you need to manage in different ways. And I think I lent on them to help and mentor me, and they did. People like Dan Freund, Scott Sorachak, Kelly Tran, CEO, Giles Palmer, Evan Walser earlier in my, these are all people I still speak to, all of them, about WhatsApp and stuff like that. So they come from friends. And I think these are the people who've really helped me on our way, because when you wake up and you're not entirely sure what to do, or you have a challenging presentation or all that, the question is, it's the unknown. And these people have been great in contextualizing it and helping me on that journey. But it just makes you become a better leader. But at the moment, you can't see the wood from the trees while you're doing it. It's not until you've been through that process that you look
yeah.
back in a year and see how much you've changed. And I think that's it. So, this ability to do it. And throughout that, you're feeling slightly scared and uncomfortable, but you realize that's normal because that's how you grow, I think. And the question is, and you just get better at it. It's practice.
It definitely is. It definitely is. The the when you made that transition into leadership, because I don't, I, most people, my own personal experience as well of moving into leadership is that I worked in a company and an environment where that was really the path to progression. You always steered on the next step that you take is that, because that's how you increase your level of responsibility and your salary and your earnings, with not that much acknowledgement as to whether you had the required skill set to be able to be a good leader. That's what happened, and then you learn. When you made that transition, and some of those people that you referenced as being leaders that you worked with who helped you, what was the thing that you lacked, looking back on it at the time, that the gap that you had to fill in terms of skill to be a better leader?
Yeah, and I think it was the one thing I had is that when I led a team when I was at kind of News Corp, then took a bit of a step back at Brandwatch to become an IC, proved myself there, and then became a leader again. So I'd had a bit of leadership and took a bit of a kind of squiggly path. But I think the one thing I had was I had credibility because as an IC, I proved myself that I could sell decent deals and being a top performer. But I guess it was getting back into that seat. It was actually how you lead people, get them to believe in themselves. And I think it was more of that kind of like servant leadership empathy bit that perhaps I was missing at that point. And I think that's where it is. And this was something that culturally came in. We moved from a kind of command and control system to actually, you as a leader are very much, you need to be empathetic and listen. And I believe it's the right way to do it because you tend to get best results from it. But that needed quite a lot of time and attention. Just in order to, like, rather than telling people what to do, was almost to coach them to hear all their problems and then suggest. And it's that the old cliche of, you teach a man to fish, he'll end up kind of fishing for himself rather than giving him. And so it's that kind of element of building it up.
Yeah.
And I think then as we scaled, it was really the help I got from others was getting those kind of corporate chops. So I'd worked in that environment. So
Sure.
alien. Once you flip from VC to private equity, it is a different world. There's a lot more support, but the expectation is very different as well. And the way that you have to present yourself internally, even as a VP or SVP, to
Yeah.
the executive team and then also the private equity investors is very different. And it's quite intimidating at first. You need to sit in a boardroom and you need to know your stuff. So there's a lot of help in even just preparing for that kind of 40-minute section in a meeting, in which you're absolutely dripping with sweat because you're terrified. Well, that wasn't that bad. They asked some great questions. But if you hadn't been prepped for it, you know that you're going to be in a world of pain. So I think those are the elements. And it talks about, as you scale with a company, you constantly got to be learning, because by that point, you're taking all the empathetic leadership, as granted because you've been doing it. And then you're suddenly put in a situation where you have to learn something else. And then it's presenting to large rooms of people. There's constantly this thing of you're endlessly growing, and you will always need support for that, because you can't do it on your own. And you need someone to lean on to say, I'm worried, I'm concerned, is this good enough? And I think that's where it happened.
I think that it makes so much sense. But the thing that stands out to me that I've learned from speaking to other people is that when you do get the chance to join a business like a Brandwatch or a company and be part of a really successful growth journey, what I've understood from speaking to other people is that you are aware all the time that the business is probably growing and developing at a faster rate than you are able to develop. The speed of development is outstripping your personal ability to develop. So you're constantly trying to catch up. Does that make sense? Is it,
And it's like
and
you're constantly got this deficit. And I think the journey at Brandwatch was very much like that, because we did a lot of M&A where I think Brandwatch was 75, Crimson Hexagon was 35. We suddenly became $100 million business, but we didn't have that education gap between 75 and 35 where we'd actually grown and understood what the difficulties were there. It was a kind of cut and shut job. So there is that
yeah,
element, you're constantly slightly behind anyway. And then of course, if you do lots of M&A, then you've got all the additional stuff of the cultural elements, as well as the people, as well as the business practices. So you're constantly living in a state of kind of organized and controlled chaos, but it is chaotic. It's not for everyone. In addition to knowing that, actually, do you have the right people to actually take you on the next journey? Because some people can't do the scale up piece between 100 and 200. It's a slightly different set of requirements. So you either kind of level people up to that level so they can do it, which is far easier, but there's some people who can't. So then you've got to also be quite honest as a leader to say, actually, are my lieutenants and their managers the people who are fit for this job? And if not, you need to look to replace them. And of course, and that creates difficulties as well. So it is difficult because you've got to be brutally transparent and honest with yourself about your own skill set and what you need to do. Make sure that your team also has those, and also then make sure that your leader is also giving you the help you need. So it is crazy. Just talking about it now, it becomes apparent.
yeah.
You tend to block off the bad parts and get rose-tinted spectacles about everything that went right. I'm getting PTSD.
We're coming on to the bad parts. Don't worry. But before we do, I think you probably had a chance maybe to reflect on this more since leaving Brandwatch, but there's so much success there. Was there a moment or a time where you did something that was quite different and it was an absolute just rocket ship of a success, like something that you changed or a new approach where you just saw huge success and maybe it wasn't expected?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of stuff. We did quite a lot of stuff when I was running the partner team that was very successful, just in terms of messing around with the way that we onboarded partners, got them on, when we saw a huge exponential growth. It wasn't that the money wasn't as big in terms of the stream, but the indirect revenue stream nearly quintupled over 4 or 5 years just by us, for these people. But I would say elsewhere, I love these stories of where someone made one small marginal change and it had exponential results. But I think also the way we looked at it is, I'm a big believer in marginal gains more generally, is how can you start to get 1% better every day around the edges? That's like a
Yeah,
37x return in a year. And we did start to do that as a team, where I think we got pretty good, was actually going what we call like after action reports. Like after every meeting, it's what went well, what didn't go well,
sure.
what
Yeah,
are we going to change as a result of that. So we were really honest in our feedback. And as a result, we started to really shift the dial on just face-to-face meetings, then the Zoom meetings, getting the deck in order, getting rid of slides because they didn't work. And this all seems fairly obvious stuff, but what you start to do is build up this kind of velocity where you're constantly making changes, improving, leaving bits out, seeing what the response from clients are. And that has a huge impact because you get that 37x return across a number of different elements of the sales process. And that's when you start to see bookings. And there's a kind of inflection point where the kind of you see that happen. So I think that's what we got good at. But I think in terms of the change, it was like in partner land where we saw that. And it was just making Brandwatch is a reasonably complex sale. So what we together was like put together packages and training where they could actually take it, conceptually sell it for us, help us paint the fence. And that's where we really saw it kind of lift off in that way, taking the complex, making it simple. But I think that's sales in general, isn't it? Making things as simple as possible, not at the cost of being simplistic. It's how sort of Steve Jobs always saw the world, is you have to take concepts that are very difficult, make them explainable to a 6-year-old, and then you're going to have success thereafter.
I th- I think that's yeah, you've distilled that perfectly. It's the partnership point is actually something even in our business that I didn't appreciate. That if you really prioritized it as a channel, then and a lot of companies don't necessarily, but if you when you do, I've seen and spoken to enough people now who've said get it right, and actually it's surprising how good it can be. And then the point on kind of reflection, there's a book called Black Box Thinking. I don't know if you've heard of it, by Matthew Syed, and it basically talks about it breaks down what can be learned from the idea of aircraft, the idea that you had these planes up in the sky that were having issues and crashing and they didn't know what had happened and they could never work out what happened because everyone was dead. And then they went, hang on, let's build something that records everything that happens in that aircraft. And so when something does go wrong, unfortunately, we'll be able to learn exactly why it went wrong and learn from our mistakes. And I find that fascinating, that idea of just reflection, which doesn't happen enough, I think, in most people's businesses because it's always on to the next thing. So it's, the reflection point's really important, really important. So we're going to get onto the bad stuff, not bad stuff, the areas that are always where you learn the most. Is there a time or a moment, something that you maybe tried that just didn't work, like an idea that you had where you thought this is absolutely going to work and it just didn't happen?
Oh God, there are quite a few occasions of that. I mean, I think the one thing is, I mean, I'll give an example. Yeah, when we kind of looked at some pricing and packaging, which was we tried to simplify it and ended up doing anything but that. And the real reason is that it was decisions were made at a kind of more senior level where we still got people involved doing the day to day, but we didn't make the group wide enough. And I think therefore
Okay.
with these packages. So I think that the reflection of that is that you really need, this is about communication. I think any mistake that you make across a business where you implement something, you do need to get direct feedback from the sort of the ground up, the boots on the ground, the management, to make sure that actually what you're implementing is effective, because they're the people who have to speak to the clients. They're the ones who have to send, the changes in pricing. They're the ones who have to explain it to our existing customer base. So you've got to look at the repercussions of what seemingly a small, simple change. The question is, if you were to put this in front of a client, what would they say? Do you actually understand it yourself? And this can be anything from everything from a rate card change to a kind of how we actually engage with our customers. So I think that's what I learned, is that you have to really, it's about bringing the people with you, but you've got to also think it through, get enough feedback, make sure that's going back up to the executive. And if you're not feeling it, then just don't go ahead with it. Stand your ground on that element. And I think that was one where, we got a bit of backlash and ended up going back on where we were, which is fine, but you learn this way. And it was one of communication and I think poor decision making, which is, again, it's a life lesson. It made me think, I do think of that often when I'm having to look at changes, even if they seem small at the point and might make sense. The question is, what are the ricochet or the kind
Yeah.
of throwing a stone in a pond? Where are the ripples going to go out to? Because often people don't think it through, and small changes in a bigger organization often have far bigger impacts than people think.
And if you look at obviously we get to speak to a lot of candidates every week who are looking, either actively looking or considering moving. And when you start to distill and analyze the reasons for leaving, why is it not working out? And they do vary, but that is one of the themes that comes up, which is broadly it falls under leadership, but it's not, when you actually dig into it, it's actually the ability to communicate change. And it's not that a lack of understanding around knowing that change is inevitable and has to happen. And I think actually, simplistically maybe, but I do believe that you can change absolutely anything in a business as long as you communicate it well.
Yeah.
And get the communication right. It won't always be successful, but as long as you get the communication right, then people know what they're getting into. And I think it's a really, I say easy because it's not easy, I know that, but just reflecting back then as you were saying that, I was thinking, how many people do I speak to on a monthly basis? So when you actually get into it, it's stuff's changing in the business and they didn't know. And they just didn't know, no one told them, or what they were told was very different to the outcome. So yeah, I think communication is.
It is, and I think I've had some very good leaders, some less so, who've been able to do that. Especially, sometimes you have to deliver difficult messages, and it could be reductions in force, RIFs, as they call it, where you're getting rid of 15-20% of the company. It could be difficult issues like gender pay gap, and each time I've seen some impressive people where the news is bad, but they've got in front of the company and they've delivered it in a way that they're very open, they're authentic, they're not trying to polish it or hide anything. And I think that goes a long way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't deliver bad news. I think how you do it is really important as well. And then remain open for feedback and discussions with certain people. And that's what good communication and I think good leadership is about. It's not just about spinning the good news, it's about recognizing when you're wrong, delivering bad news, and then remaining open to understand and that kind of feedback loop. So, yeah.
Agreed. Completely agree. What's the kind of stuff that keeps you up at night? When it comes, at any moment, actually, you might just be a wonderful sound sleeper who never has these issues. But I think most people I speak to have something which they go, yeah, do you know what? In those moments and those times, that's the thing that really that keeps me up.
Yeah, it's always have I forgotten to do something? Now I'm back selling, actually. It is the kind of, have I done everything I need to do? And are we going to close the deal? And it's more of it's a kind of like slight paranoia mixed with excitement. In case we've got, we really got to get this as closed as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
But I was saying, what's keeping me looking toward the next 12 months? Working Dig is an AI company, but I think we touched on it earlier. The question is like, how much and how quickly is AI going to change our entire world? I think a lot of people are saying, oh, we don't need to worry about it. These kind of AI BDR tools aren't going to replace them. And I go, not today. I've seen a few of them, but I reckon V2, which could be as soon as 6 to 9 months, they might start getting there. So I think the main thing is it's a mix of kind of curiosity, which is actually how quickly is the world changing? Am I keeping up with it? And I like to think I'm fairly on top of it. But the question is actually, do we need to make changes and think about operating differently today? Because then by the time we've been through it in 3-6 months, we'll be ahead of the game. So it's more of the case of, yes, you need to get sales, you make sure the business is building, but you also now play a slight game of 3D chess where you need to think, actually, we've got interesting headwinds with all the tariffs going on and more uncertainty in the world, plus this AI revolution. I believe is as important as the Apollo moon landing for our kind of generation. But I don't think that's quite manifested itself in the sort of general psychology of people. And I think we're suddenly going to see another inflection point where suddenly it goes through. There will be layoffs on the bad side, as I say, that white collar bloodbath we mentioned earlier, but there are going to be loads of positives. So it's really the worry. It comes back to, I think, that conversation again we've touched on, which is that perpetual change, which is now being accelerated by the AI technology. And the question is, have you done enough as a business to take advantage of that, to give you a leadership position over your competitors? Or are you just going from day to day and thinking everything's going to be all right? I got my 2016 playbook in place and that's going to be fine, because that's long gone, I think.
Yeah, I remember you and I talking about that before a few weeks ago, saying that a sales leader that you bring into a business now, and the whole purpose of this podcast is to talk about the challenges of and the real honest assessment of what it takes to scale a business. And I think that often founders would seek comfort in finding a leader who's been there and done it before because they hope that they can. But the
Yeah.
reality is what you were doing 10 years ago in that business compared to what you're going to do today is chalk and cheese, right?
Absolutely. Everything, even in it changed with COVID and remote working. Then we had the great inflationary period where we had to pivot from like cheap hyper growth to becoming profitable. So we're constantly evolving. And I think people tend to forget this. And now we're going through another cycle of change, which is based on technology, in a way like global issues around war, trade, and everything else. So I think the Chinese curse is may you live in interesting times. And I certainly think we are. But I think like all bets are off in terms of leadership. And I think a lot of companies are still thinking in slightly 2020 ways of how you've been the kind of sales leader that you hire, firm handshake and white teeth. But it's like that's gone, I think. And now you are going to find it's about agility, it's about speed, everything that comes with AI, all the benefits, but you now need to build that into your business and
Yeah.
work out how you can optimize it and scale quickly. And I don't think we're that far off potentially having a company that's worth $1 billion that is made of 3 or 4 people. I think that's entirely feasible in the next couple of years. That's how quickly things will change.
No, I agree. I agree. It's relentless, the speed of change. Do you, with so much noise, because we were talking about this before the conversation around LinkedIn as a platform, for example, and just the amount of content that is shared and the breadth of content that is actually shared on what is a business platform. But actually having walked the walk of scaling a business like a Brandwatch from 20 to 300 million and with a group of amazing people around you, you must see information, stories, news out there on various platforms that you just think that is such a load of BS. Like it's a complete myth. And it just to hone it back to the topic of the podcast around the challenges that are this is not for everyone, and it's bloody hard to do and get right. But what do you see, or what have you experienced in over the years in your career where you just think that is the biggest load of BS or the biggest myth that you've seen?
Oh, there's so much of it. Sadly, like LinkedIn is crawling with it. It's a great platform in many ways, but it's now just full of, we mentioned earlier, the concept of survival bias. All you hear about is the companies that succeeded and generally the founder whose specific process or system or pure genius allowed it to happen. There's no talk of luck or timing, serendipity element, or even the rest of the team who made it successful. It's generally these sort of egotists who are there. And it's great for them and their profile. But I also find that they're often talking a bit of a game here, or it's a bit of clickbait. And I think that's also with the prevalence of what I think has been described as hustle porn, which is this idea that any of us can be entrepreneurs. If we get up at 4:30 in the morning, have an ice bath, journal, and then work for 16 hours, no one talks about if you have a crap idea, it's still crap. The whole point is it's not going to work. So I think there's this huge myth around what it takes to build a business. And I think there are great leaders who are very inspirational, who can get a group of people together with a great idea and build something fantastic. And I'm seeing that where I am at Dig at the moment, but it's still hard work is a given, I think. But I think the other element is there is sometimes a lack of luck and timing and all the elements that go around with it. You can probably control around 5% of what you do in your individual. The rest is out of it. So I'd love to see people a bit more humble about what it took. And which is, I love the idea of this podcast is we're actually talking about ideas. And the biggest myth, I think, is that failure is bad. I don't believe in that at all. I think the failure is probably the thing we learn from the most. So we should really be celebrating it, I think.
Championing it, yeah.
Yeah, that's what we should be looking at, is championing failure, not catastrophic failure, which takes down businesses. But the fact is that you tried something, it didn't work. And what did you learn and what did you change as a result of that? That's where we need to focus, I think, more and normalize it.
Need to do more of that. I agree. I think, but you don't see enough of it. I think hopefully the interviews that we do on this podcast and we start to promote as you see more of it, because actually, as you say, there is this thing of I've got an idea, and if I just work hard enough, then if it's a crap idea, I love that line because it's so true. Not enough people. Somebody I've spoken to fairly recently said that not enough emphasis is given to the fact that there's a lot of people out there who think that they're really successful because they're incredible.
Yeah.
And and actually they're good, but the success that was created was because right product, right time, right group of people, and a healthy dose of luck. And that's okay. That's actually okay to admit that all those things aligned. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you bad at your job. It doesn't mean you weren't successful. But let's not overemphasize that so much of that success was driven by you, because the reality is I just don't think that's the case.
And I agree with you. Peter Thiel asks a great interview question, which is like, what important truth do very few people agree with you on? It's a really
Yeah.
difficult question. But I think
Yeah.
what it is the fact that actually we should celebrate failure, because actually that's what generally perpetuates success. And again, behind every founder's story is normally multiple failures. Richard Branson is one of the few who might admit to it, for example. But there are many other examples where people have failed businesses behind them, and it's only hit six that they get it. But then, of
Yeah.
course, they reinvent their history. The rest is written off. But that's a really important part of, I think, bringing more honest discussion, not only into businesses and the sections like LinkedIn, but also then making sure that people actually enter business with knowing all the options, that the failure rate is potentially 94%. And getting up at 4:30 in an ice bath isn't going to change the fact that your idea sucks.
Nothing against ice baths, obviously.
I quite like ice baths, but it's kind of like
No, I get it. I definitely get it. A couple of questions before we wrap things up, Charlie. Firstly, I think I'm personally always curious to understand what tech you're using, what stuff that maybe that different, or just it doesn't have to be different at all. Actually, just the stuff that you love to use that really helps you and has helped you in your role and life.
Yeah, exactly. I would say from a kind of tech sales perspective, the platform that I think certainly at Brandwatch I was most impressed with was Clary. It's a kind of
Okay.
forecasting tool. It's everything Salesforce should be, really. And
Okay.
it's a rather fairly expensive plugin, but it's fantastic. And it basically looks at kind of forecasting, revenue leak, and it's got good AI tools over it. But that was, I
Yeah.
think, a game changer in building into being able to report more efficiently, but also accountability, because everyone
Yeah.
has to fill their section in and you can do reports for the exec. But you can see from the IC up to the management where people have changed their forecasts and where the revenue leak is. So I think it's really clever as a business to be able to see that visually and actually. But I think for me now in the day to day, really it's a mix of kind of Perplexity, Claude, and OpenAI. These
Yeah.
platforms, which are currently free, or you can pay $20 a month, have changed everything just in terms of the ability to research, understand customers. So before you jump on a customer call, you can research a brand, you can research the individual. Something that would have taken an hour, you can do probably in 3 minutes. Really get them to write decent prompts and scripts to uncover leads for you. If you're looking at
Yeah.
kind of crisis and response, is to understand which companies had a crisis in the last few weeks. There's so much you can do. I recommend people just really get curious with this, start playing around with it, and it's a game changer in terms of how you approach sales, just in terms of your pre-call preparation, your post-call wash up and wrap up, and then also just actually understanding broader sector needs. It is absolutely mind-boggling what you can do.
Agreed. Agreed. And certainly personally, I can say I probably have just scratched the surface in terms of the capabilities, but it's, yeah, and free, really. And if not free, then very cheap for something that's hugely valuable. Last question before we finish is, if you could give a piece of advice to founders, senior leaders that are going through maybe some of the following the path that you have already been on, what would it be?
I think that the companies that do well are the ones that scale with intention. What do I mean by that? I think it's about not just about speed, it's about scaling with clarity, purpose, and focus. So I think it is complex. I'm seeing that at Dig now, is that particularly as you start to scale earlier companies, you want to do things concurrently, not consecutively, but that doesn't always happen to be the case. So you really do have to think through and be 2 steps ahead. But I think what that comes back to is you do have to scale with intention. You need to understand where that company is going. And that's also true once you get over 100 or 200 million, but you really need to be living 6 to 9 months in the future as well as in the here and now. So there's a bit of time travel involved, as well as learning from your mistakes. So you are literally past, present, and future. But I think that's a good mindset to have, to going, okay, fine, where do we mess things up? What have we improved? What do we need to do today? But if I look 6 to 9 months ahead, where are our biggest weaknesses, where could we go wrong? And that's how you build with purpose and intention. And I think that's how companies will succeed. It's difficult because also you've got to try and make sure that what you're doing is right. And none of us have a crystal ball and it's not. But that would be my advice, is live in 3 different time zones.
No, I think that I can, that point is, I've definitely experienced that. I've seen so many people who have, and spoken to so many leaders who, I think the biggest one that I see personally is that they don't reflect back. And I think that's probably a society thing where people don't give themselves the time to reflect on what's gone and what hasn't gone well. Because it's not always about what's not been, there's also the chance to go, that went really well. And sometimes people don't actually analyze why they were successful. It's easy to celebrate the success and then go, right, next thing.
Yeah.
And actually, why did we win that account? Why was that successful? Why did that person do so well in that moment? And also to project forward, but with I think the time frame is quite key as well. So you can get, and I definitely, I can say I've sometimes been guilty of looking too far ahead and going, well, and actually it doesn't matter because I can't possibly predict
Yeah.
what's going to happen in 2 years from now in our industry. That's great advice. Great advice. Charlie, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been great. And
Everything that I expected it to and more, like so many nuggets. And it's not, I think when you and I first spoke and I really understood, I knew Brandwatch as a business just from the outside looking in, but there really aren't loads of people who've been on the journey, not just the revenue journey, which is hugely significant, but to have done that within one business and really experience what that's is really quite unique. And I think there's so many smaller businesses looking to go on that journey who could benefit from listening to this, learning from people like you who've had that experience. So yeah, thank you. I really appreciate your time.
brilliant. Thank you, everyone. See you all
Cheers,
soon.
Charlie.